In the lawless town of Blackwood Creek, a father's love was worth less than a bottle of cheap whiskey. You might think you know how this story goes. The damsel in distress, the villain, the hero. But you'd be wrong. When a drunkard auctioned off his own daughter to a terrifying mountain man because she was broken, the entire town watched in silence. But as the stranger lifted her onto his saddle, he didn't check her teeth or her hands. He leaned in and whispered 6 words that changed everything. I know you can hear me. This is the story of Ada Miller. The year was 1887, and the air inside the Golden Steer Saloon tasted of stale tobacco, unwashed bodies, and desperation. Outside, the wind howled through the canyons of the Wyoming Territory, kicking up dust that coated the windows in a layer of grime. But inside, the heat was suffocating. Ada Miller sat on a wobbly wooden stool in the corner, her eyes fixed on the scuffed tips of her boots. She had learned long ago that invisibility was her only armor. If she didn't move, didn't look up, and certainly didn't speak, maybe the world would forget she existed. She wore a faded calico dress that had seen better years, patched at the elbows and hem hanging loosely on her frame. At the center table, the source of her misery was currently losing the last of their money. Jebediah Miller was a man eaten alive by his own vices. His face was a map of broken capillaries and sun damage, his eyes watery and bloodshot. He slammed a fist onto the table, making the poker chips jump. "You're cheating Dutch, I know you are," Jebediah slurred, spittle flying from his lips. Dutch, a heavy-set man with a scar running through his left eyebrow, didn't even flinch. He just calmly dealt another card. "The only thing cheating you, Jeb, is that bottle in your hand. You're out of cash. Fold or get out." The tension in the room spiked. The piano player at the corner stopped midway through a rendition of Buffalo Gals. In Blackwood Creek, silence usually meant gunsmoke was about to follow. Ada felt her heart hammering against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. She kept her face blank, her eyes vacant. To the world, Ada was the Miller mute, the deaf and dumb girl who was as useful as a 3-legged horse. It was a lie she had constructed 5 years ago, after her mother passed, and Jebediah's grief turned into a violent rage. Silence was safer. Silence didn't provoke. "I ain't out." Jebediah growled, his desperation making him reckless. He looked around the room, his gaze wooled until it landed on the corner. On her. Ada's stomach dropped. "Please, Papa. No." Jebediah stood up his chair, scraping loudly against the floorboards. He stumbled over to her, grabbing her by the upper arm. His grip was bruising. He dragged her toward the poker table like a sack of grain. "Here," Jebediah announced, shoving her forward so she stumbled into the table edge. "I bet the girl." A murmur rippled through the saloon. Even the hardened cattle drovers and miners looked uncomfortable. Selling a horse was one thing. Betting your own flesh and blood was a darkness even they hesitated to touch. Dutch looked at Ada, his eyes narrowing. "I run a saloon, Jeb, not a brothel. Besides, everyone knows she's broken. Deaf as a post and mute to boot. What good is she to me? She cooks." Jebediah pleaded, his voice cracking. "She cleans. She's strong as an ox despite how she looks. And she don't talk back, never creates a fuss. A quiet woman is worth her weight in gold, ain't she?" "She's deaf," Dutch scoffed, throwing his cards down. "I don't have time to use hand signals to tell a scullery maid to wash a glass. Get out, Jeb." "Just one hand," Jebediah screamed, raising his hand as if to strike her. Ada flinched, an instinctive reaction she couldn't suppress. "I need to win it back. I'll take the bet." The voice came from the darkest corner of the room near the back exit. It was a voice like grinding gravel, deep, resonant, and terrifyingly calm. Every head turned. Rising from the shadows was a man who seemed to take up all the air in the room. He was massive, standing well over 6 feet, with shoulders that spanned the width of a doorframe. He wore a heavy coat made of bear fur, dusted with snow from the high peaks. His face was obscured by a thick, dark beard and the brim of a battered Stetson, but his eyes were piercingly blue, cold as a mountain stream. He was a stranger, a mountain man, the kind who came down from the peaks only once a year to trade furs and disappear again. He walked to the table, his heavy boots thudding with a rhythmic finality. He didn't look at Jebediah. He looked at Ada. Ada tried to keep her deaf stare unfocused, but she could feel the weight of his gaze. It felt like he was peeling back her skin and looking at the trembling soul beneath. "You want to bet the girl?" the mountain man asked, tossing a heavy leather pouch onto the table. It landed with a distinct heavy clink of gold nuggets, not coins. "I'm not playing cards, I'm buying." Jebediah's eyes widened greed, instantly replacing his anger. He looked at the pouch, then at the man. That's gold dust. "Enough to keep you in whiskey until your liver rots," the stranger said. "Take it, and she's mine, right now." "Done." Jebediah snatched the pouch before anyone could blink. He didn't even look at Ada. He didn't say goodbye. He just tore the strings open and buried his nose in the gold. "Get your things," the stranger said to Ada. She didn't move. She had to maintain the act. If she reacted to his voice, the whole town would know she'd been lying for years. They would know she had heard every insult, every secret, every plan. The stranger seemed to realize this. He stepped closer, towering over her. He didn't grab her roughly like her father. He simply placed a large, calloused hand on her shoulder and steered her toward the door. "Take her!" Jebediah shouted from the table, already signaling for a bottle. "She's deaf. Take her, and good riddance." The walk to the door felt like a funeral march. The eyes of the townspeople burned into her back. Pity, disgust, amusement. Ada kept her head down, clutching her shawl tight. She was property now, sold to a wild man who lived where the wolves roamed. Terror clawed at her throat, but she swallowed it down. Survive, she told herself. Just survive. Outside, the cold air hit her like a physical blow. The sun was setting, casting long, bloody shadows across the mud-slicked street. The stranger had a massive black stallion tied to the hitching post, alongside a pack mule laden with supplies. He turned to her. Up close, he was even more intimidating. He smelled of pine resin wood smoke and something metallic like old blood. He reached out effortlessly, lifting her by the waist to settle her onto the front of his saddle. For a moment, her face was inches from his. His beard brushed her cheek. Time seemed to freeze. Ada braced herself for him to shout at her, to make hand gestures to treat her like the livestock she had just been sold as. Instead, he leaned in his lips, brushing her ear. The movement was intimate, shocking. "You can drop the act, Ada." He whispered, his voice a low rumble that vibrated through her chest. "I watched you in there. You flinched when the piano stopped. You held your breath when the cards hit the table." Ada froze, her blood turning to ice. Her eyes snapped to his wide with panic. She opened her mouth to deny it, but no sound came out. He pulled back, his blue eyes locking onto hers with an intensity that made her knees weak. There was no malice in his face, but there was no kindness either, just a brutal, terrifying truth. "I know you can hear me," he said loud enough only for the two of them. "And where we're going, you're going to need all your senses if you want to stay alive." He swung up into the saddle behind her, his arms caging her in as he took the reins. "My name is Silas Kincaid. Don't make me regret this." He kicked the horse into a gallop, leaving Blackwood Creek and her father behind in the dust. As they rode toward the dark, looming silhouette of the mountains, Ada realized with a chilling certainty She hadn't just been sold. She had been caught, and Silas Kincaid was far more dangerous than any drunkard with a poker habit. The journey up the mountain was not a gentle ride. It was a grueling ascent into a world that felt increasingly hostile. As the town of Blackwood Creek became nothing more than a flickering speck of light in the valley below, the temperature plummeted. Ada sat rigidly in the saddle, her back pressed against Silas Kincaid's chest. She tried to hold herself away from him, to maintain some semblance of distance, but the rhythmic gait of the horse and the biting cold forced her to lean back. He was a furnace of heat, a solid wall of muscle that seemed impervious to the wind. His discovery of her secret terrified her more than the cold. For 5 years, she had fooled doctors, neighbors, and her own father. How had this stranger seen through it in 5 minutes? "You're shivering," Silas said. It wasn't a question. Ada didn't answer. She bit her lip, staring at the horse's mane. "If I speak, I admit it. If I admit it, I have no defense." Silas sighed a sound of annoyance. He shifted the reins to one hand and began to unbutton his heavy bear fur coat with the other. Before she could figure out what he was doing, he wrapped the left side of the massive coat around her, engulfing her small frame against his side. "Stubborn," he muttered. "I paid good gold for you. I'm not going to let you freeze to death before we even reach the timberline." The warmth was instant and overwhelming. It smelled of him wild and earthy. Ada felt a traitorous tear slip down her cold cheek. It had been years since anyone had cared if she was cold. They rode for hours in silence. The path narrowed, turning from a wagon trail into a treacherous goat path winding up the side of a cliff. To her right was a drop into nothingness. To her left, the sheer rock face. The horse, a beast Silas called Shadow, stepped with sure-footed confidence, but Ada closed her eyes every time a hoof slipped on loose shale. "Open your eyes," Silas commanded. His voice was right in her ear again. "Fear kills you up here. You need to see where you're going." Ada opened her eyes. The moon had risen, painting the snow-capped peaks in silver and blue. It was terrifying, yes, but also breathtakingly beautiful. "Why?" she whispered. The word scratched her throat, unused and rusty. It was the first time she had spoken to another human being in 825 days. She felt Silas stiffen slightly behind her. He heard it. "Why what?" he asked, not making a big deal of her broken silence. "Why buy me?" she rasped, her voice barely audible over the wind. "If you know I'm a liar, why bring me here?" Silas didn't answer immediately. He guided the horse around a fallen pine tree before speaking. "I didn't buy you for your cooking, Ada. And I didn't buy you to warm my bed so you can stop shaking like a leaf." Ada turned her head, slightly daring to look up at his profile. His jaw was set hard, his eyes scanning the tree line. "Then what?" she asked. "I need someone who can listen," Silas said, his voice dropping an octave. "Someone who can listen to things others ignore, and someone who knows how to keep their mouth shut." "I'm good at that," she said bitterly. "We'll see," Silas replied. "Because up at the cabin, it's not the wind you have to worry about. There are things in these mountains, men and beasts, that hunt by sound. Your silence isn't just a trick anymore, Ada. It's the only thing that's going to keep us breathing." He pulled the horse to a halt. They had reached a small plateau. In the center sat a cabin built of rough-hewn logs, smoke curling lazily from the chimney. It looked sturdy like a fortress. "Home," Silas grunted. He dismounted and reached up to help her down. As her boots hit the crunching snow, her legs gave out numb from the ride. Silas caught her effortlessly, holding her upright. For a second, they stood chest to chest in the moonlight. Ada looked up at him, searching for cruelty in his face. She found hardness, yes. Scars, a weariness that went bone deep, but not the cruelty she saw in her father. "Go inside," he ordered, nodding toward the door. "Bar it behind you. Do not open it unless you hear me knock 3 times. Pause and knock twice." "Where are you going?" she asked, panic rising again. Silas turned back to the horse, pulling a Winchester rifle from its scabbard. He cocked the lever, the metallic clack-clack echoing loudly in the stillness. "We were followed," Silas said calmly. "Go inside, Ada, and for God's sake, be quiet." Ada scrambled toward the cabin door, her heart pounding in her throat. She threw herself inside, slamming the heavy oak door and dropping the thick wooden bar into place. She pressed her ear against the rough wood, straining to hear. Outside, the wind whistled, then the sound of a horse whinnying, and then the distinct, terrifying crack of a gunshot. Ada slid down the door to the floor, pulling her knees to her chest. She covered her mouth with both hands to stifle a scream. Silas Kincaid was right. Her silence was no longer a game. It was a weapon, and the war had just begun. The silence in the cabin was heavier than the timber beams holding up the roof. Ada sat huddled against the rough logs of the wall, her knees drawn to her chest, eyes fixed on the door. Every creak of the wood, as the temperature dropped, sounded like a footstep. Every gust of wind sounded like a scream. She counted the seconds, then the minutes. 10 minutes. 20. Had Silas fallen? If he was dead, she was trapped up here in the freezing wilderness with whoever had pulled that trigger. She looked around the cabin for a weapon. A heavy cast-iron skillet hung by the hearth. A skinning knife lay on the table. She scrambled up, grabbing the knife. It felt heavy and foreign in her hand, the handle made of smooth antler. Knock, knock, knock. Ada froze. Her heart hammered against her ribs. Pause. Knock, knock. The signal. She rushed to the door but hesitated, her hand hovering over the heavy wooden bar. "Silas," she whispered, forgetting for a moment that she was supposed to be the mute girl to the rest of the world. "Open the door, Ada," came the gruff reply. He sounded winded. She lifted the bar and swung the door open. A gust of snow blew in, followed immediately by Silas. He kicked the door shut behind him and threw the bolt back into place with a definitive thud. He looked terrifying. The bear fur coat was matted with snow, and there was a dark, wet stain spreading across his left sleeve. He wasn't carrying the rifle. It was strapped to his back. In his hand, he held a crumpled piece of paper. "You're hurt." Ada said the words slipping out before she could stop them. She dropped the knife on the table and moved toward him, instinct taking over. "Grazed," Silas grunted, shrugging off the heavy coat. Underneath he wore a thick flannel shirt, now torn at the bicep, revealing a sluggishly bleeding gash. "Bullet just kissed the skin. I've had worse from shaving." He walked to the hearth, kneeling to stoke the dying embers into a roaring fire. The orange light illuminated his face. He looked exhausted, the lines around his eyes deep with tension. "Who was it?" Ada asked, finding her voice growing stronger. The fear was still there, but indignation was rising to meet it. He had dragged her into a war zone. Silas stood up and tossed the crumpled paper onto the table. It landed next to the knife she had held. "A scout, hired gun," Silas said, walking over to a basin of water to wash the blood from his arm. "Working for the Railway Commission, or so he thought." Ada looked at the paper. It was a sketch, a rough charcoal drawing of Silas's face with a price written underneath $5,000. "You're a wanted man," Ada breathed. The realization hit her like a physical blow. She hadn't been sold to a trapper. She had been sold to an outlaw. Silas scoffed, grabbing a rag and dousing it in whiskey before pressing it to his wound. He hissed through his teeth but didn't flinch. "I'm not a criminal, Ada. I'm a liability. There's a difference." He turned to face her, the firelight catching the intense blue of his eyes. That man out there wasn't alone. He was a point man. He fires a shot to signal he found the target. That means the rest of his posse is about an hour behind him, maybe 2 if the snow thickens. So we have to leave, Ada said, looking at the door. No. Silas shook his head. In this storm, we'd be dead in a mile. Shadow is strong, but he can't carry 2 of us through 3 feet of drift snow at night. We stay. We defend the cabin. He walked over to her, looming large. The smell of gunpowder was sharp on him now, mixing with the pine and blood. This is why I bought you, he said, his voice low and serious. I have a condition, Ada. Ada frowned, confused. A condition? Silas tapped his right ear. Explosion in a mine 5 years ago. My right ear is dead. Stone dead. And my left rings like a church bell when the pressure drops or the wind howls. Ada stared at him. The big, terrifying mountain man was half deaf. I can hear voices fine if I'm looking at you, Silas admitted, a rare look of vulnerability flashing across his face before he masked it with stoicism. But out there, in the woods, a twig snapping on my right side, I won't hear it until the knife is already in my ribs. He took a step closer, forcing her to look up at him. I watched you in town for 3 days before the poker game, he revealed. I saw you track a coyote on the edge of town, just by the sound of its paws on the gravel. I saw you flinch when a window slammed 2 streets over. You have ears like a wolf, Ada. I need them. You want me to be your guard dog? She said, her voice trembling with anger. You bought me to be a sentry. I bought you to keep us both alive, Silas corrected. If they breach this cabin, they won't just kill me. You know what men like that do to women, especially women who can't scream. The brutality of his words silenced her. He was right. There was no going back to Blackwood Creek. Her father had sold her. These men outside were killers. Her only chance of survival was this scarred, half-deaf giant standing in front of her. What do I do? She asked, steeling herself. Silas nodded approval, flickering in his eyes. He walked to a wooden chest at the foot of the bed and pulled out a smaller weapon, a double-barreled shotgun, sawed-off short. You sit in the loft, he said, pointing to the ladder leading to the rafters. There's a hatch up there, cracks in the chinking. You listen. You tell me where they're coming from. North, south, the ridge, or the valley. You happen to hear a boot crunch, snow, you signal me. And if they get in, Ada asked, weighing the heavy shotgun he pressed into her hands. Silas pulled his bowie knife from his belt, the steel gleaming. If they get in, he said darkly, you aim for the belly, and you pull both triggers. Don't hesitate. Mercy is a luxury we can't afford tonight. The storm raged for hours, burying the cabin in a cocoon of white. Inside, the fire had burned down to glowing coals to minimize the smoke leaving the room in deep shadow. Ada lay flat on her stomach in the loft, the rough wood scratching her chin. The shotgun was positioned near a small gap in the logs where the chinking had fallen away, giving her a sliver of a view of the front clearing. But her eyes were useless in the blinding snow. She had to rely on the one thing she had spent years hiding. She closed her eyes and extended her senses. She could hear the wind shrieking around the eaves like a banshee. She could hear the settling of the logs. Below her, she could hear the rhythmic breathing of Silas, who sat in a chair facing the door, his Winchester rifle across his lap. Anything. Silas's voice drifted up, barely a whisper. Just the wind, she whispered back. The acoustic of the cabin carried her voice down to him. Good. The snow is covering our tracks. They might have hunkered down to wait it out. Ada shifted, her muscles cramping. Silas. Yeah. Who are they really? A long silence stretched between them. For a moment, she thought he wouldn't answer. Silas Kincaid was a man of secrets built of stone and silence. "You ever hear of the Bitterroot Massacre?" he asked finally. Ada frowned. "That was the army. They cleared out a settlement of squatters 5 years ago." "It wasn't the army," Silas said, his voice thick with a suppressed rage. "It was a private militia hired by the mining syndicate. They wanted the land. The squatters wouldn't move, so they sent in a cleanup crew." Ada's breath hitched. "You were there." "I was the foreman," Silas said. "I tried to negotiate. I thought we could talk it out. But the syndicate didn't want talks. They rigged the main shaft of the mine, blew it while half the families were inside, sheltering from a storm just like this one." "That's how you lost your hearing," Ada realized. "That's how I lost everything," Silas corrected. "My wife, my son, they were in the mine." The grief in his voice was so raw, so palpable that Ada felt tears prick her eyes. She had thought her life was a tragedy because of a drunken father. But Silas was living in a graveyard of his own making. "I hunted down the men who set the charges." Silas continued, his voice devoid of emotion, now purely factual. "There were 6 of them. I found 5. The last one, the man who gave the order, is a man named Cyrus Vane. He runs the syndicate now. He knows I'm coming for him, so he sends men to stop me." "And the gold?" Ada asked. "The gold you gave my father. Bait," Silas admitted. "I knew Vane's spies were watching the saloon. I needed to make a scene. Flash some gold. Make them think I was cash-heavy and careless. I needed them to follow me up here away from the town where I could pick them off one by one." Ada felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cold. "You used me," she whispered. "You made a scene, buying me, just to draw them out." "I needed a lookout, Ada. That part is true," Silas said. "But yes, I used the spectacle. A mountain man buying a mute girl. It's the kind of gossip that travels fast." "I hate you," she said, the words slipping out. But there was no venom in them, only a tired resignation. "Get in line," Silas muttered. Suddenly, Ada sat up straight. Her skin prickled. Crunch. It was faint, muffled by the wind. But it was distinct. It wasn't the erratic shifting of a branch. It was the rhythmic, heavy compression of snow under leather. "Silas," she hissed. "Where?" He didn't question her. He shifted in his chair, bringing the rifle up. "Behind the cabin," she whispered, her heart pounding. 2 of them. Maybe 3. They aren't on horses. They're on foot. They circled back, Silas realized. They're trying to flank us. "There's a scrapping sound," Ada said, pressing her ear to the back wall of the loft. "Metal on wood," Silas cursed softly. "The back window. The shutter is loose. If they pry it open, they have a straight shot at my back. What do we do?" Silas stood up, silent as a ghost, despite his size. "You stay there. Keep that shotgun pointed at the front door. If anyone kicks it, you shoot. I'm going to introduce our guests to the hospitality of the mountain." He moved to the back of the cabin, avoiding the floorboards that creaked. He didn't go to the window. Instead, he reached for a trap-door in the floor that Ada hadn't even noticed hidden under a bear rug. "Ada," he whispered one last time. "Cover your ears." He opened the trap-door and dropped something into the darkness of the root cellar below. He slammed the door shut and dove behind the heavy oak table. Ada barely had time to clamp her hands over her ears before the world exploded. Boom! The floor of the cabin lurched. The sound was deafening, a concussive blast that shook the dust from the rafters. The explosion had come from outside, near the back foundation. Silas had rigged the perimeter. Screams erupted from the back of the cabin men, screaming in pain and surprise. "Stay down!" Silas roared. He kicked the back door open and charged out into the storm, his rifle barking. Bang, bang, bang! Ida huddled in the loft, the shotgun shaking in her hands. The The silence that followed was worse than the noise. She waited. 1 minute, 2. Then the back door creaked. Ada swung the shotgun down, aiming it at the shadowy figure entering the room. "It's me." Silas's voice came rough and breathless. He walked into the firelight. He was covered in fresh snow and his eyes were wild, the adrenaline pumping through him. "Did you get them?" Ada asked, her voice trembling. "2 dead. 1 ran off into the dark." "He won't last the night without a coat," Silas said. He looked up at her in the loft, his expression softening slightly. "You heard them, Ada. You heard them over the storm." "I told you," she said, lowering the gun. "I hear everything." Silas walked over to the ladder and reached a hand up. "Come down. It's over for tonight." Ada climbed down, her legs wobbling. When she reached the floor, Silas didn't step back. He stood close, his large hand reaching out to brush a stray lock of hair from her forehead. His fingers were rough, calloused, but his touch was surprisingly gentle. "You saved my life," he said quietly. "I saved my own," Ada countered, though her heart raced at his proximity. "Maybe we saved each other," Silas murmured. He turned to the fire, but Ada saw it, a tremor in his hand. The unshakable mountain man was shaking. The blast had likely wrung his good ear, disorienting him more than he let on. He needed her more than he admitted. "Let me look at that arm," Ada said, her voice firm. She was done being the victim. If she was going to be his partner in this war, she would take charge where she could. Silas looked at her, surprised, then nodded slowly. He sat down, letting her peel back the blood-soaked fabric of his shirt. As she cleaned the wound, the bond between them shifted. It was no longer captor and captive. It was 2 wounded animals backed into a corner, baring their teeth at the world. But outside, the wind carried a new sound. Not a footstep, not a gunshot. It was the distant, mournful howl of a wolf pack. And Ada knew with a sinking feeling in her gut that the men Silas had killed were just the beginning. Cyrus Vane wouldn't stop. And now he knew exactly where they were. The cabin was no longer a sanctuary. It was a tomb waiting to be sealed. By dawn, the storm had broken, leaving the world scoured clean and white. The silence was absolute, but Ada knew it was a lie. The man who had fled into the night would report back. The hunting party would return, and next time they wouldn't bring just 3 men. They would bring an army. "We move," Silas said, tightening the cinch on Shadow's saddle. His face was pale, drawn tight with pain. The graze on his arm was inflamed, and the ringing in his good ear, the after-effect of the explosion, had left him off balance. He stumbled slightly as he checked the stirrup. Ada stepped in her hands, firm on his forearm, to steady him. "You can barely walk, Silas. Where are we going?" "There's a trading post at Bitter Creek, about 10 miles east," Silas gritted out, leaning heavily against the horse for a moment. "Run by a man named Tobias. He's an old friend. He was with me before the massacre. He'll have horses' ammo and maybe a doctor who won't ask questions." "Can we trust him?" Ada asked, handing him his canteen. Silas looked at her, his blue eyes softening for a fraction of a second. "He pulled me out of the rubble when the mine collapsed, Ada. I trust him with my life." They rode out as the sun crested the peaks, blindingly bright against the snow. This time, Silas didn't put her in front. He sat behind her, but his grip was weaker. Ada found herself taking the reins, guiding the massive stallion down the treacherous switchbacks. She became his ears, and now his hands. Every snap of a branch made her heart jump. "Dear," she would whisper. "Ice falling," she would say, 10 minutes later. Silas would nod his head, resting against her shoulder, fighting unconsciousness. They reached Bitter Creek by late afternoon. It wasn't a town, just a cluster of shacks and a main trading post nestled in a valley that smelled of wood smoke and curing leather. Silas straightened up as they approached, forcing a mask of strength onto his features. He wouldn't show weakness, not even to a friend. A man stepped out onto the porch of the trading post. Tobias was older, with a shock of white hair and a kind, weathered face. He squinted at them, then broke into a wide, gap-toothed grin. "Silas Kincaid." "You old devil," Tobias shouted, wiping his hands on a rag. "I heard rumblings you were dead." "Disappointed," Silas called back, sliding off the horse. He landed hard, his knees buckling slightly, but he stayed upright. "Never," Tobias said, rushing down the steps to clap Silas on the uninjured shoulder. He looked at Ada, his eyes curious. "And who is this, so you finally settled down?" "This is Ada," Silas said shortly. "She's with me." "We need supplies, Tobias, and fresh horses. We've got syndicate men on our tail." Tobias's smile faltered for a second, a flicker of something unreadable passing through his eyes before the warmth returned. "Syndicate bad business, that. Come in, come in. I've got stew on the fire." Inside the post was warm and cluttered with furs, canned goods, and mining equipment. Tobias poured them coffee and set out bowls of venison stew. Ada ate hungrily, but she kept her eyes on Tobias. There was something off. It was the sound. Ada's hearing had become hyper-tuned over the years of silence. She heard the way Tobias's heart rate sped up when Silas mentioned the syndicate. She heard the slight tremor in his voice when he offered them the back room to rest. And most alarmingly, she heard the distinct rhythmic tapping of a telegraph key coming from the back office. Tap, 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 tap. "I thought the lines were down from the storm," Silas said, noticing Ada's head tilt. "They are," Tobias said, quickly, too quickly. "That's just the wind rattling the shutters, Silas. You know how this valley catches the draft." Silas nodded, too exhausted to argue. He finished his stew and leaned back, his eyes closing. "I need an hour, Tobias. Just an hour. Then we ride." "Take the back room," Tobias urged. "Rest easy, old friend." Silas stood and motioned for Ada to follow. As they entered the small storage room and closed the door, Silas slumped onto a pile of furs, his face grey. "He's lying," Ada whispered instantly, kneeling beside him. Silas opened one eye. "What?" "The telegraph," she hissed. "It wasn't the wind. Someone was sending a message. And his heart." "Silas, he's scared. Or guilty." Silas sighed, scrubbing a hand over his face. "You're paranoid, Ada. Tobias is family. He hates the syndicate as much as I do." "People change," she insisted, grabbing his hand. "We have to leave. Now!" Silas looked at her, really looked at her. In the dim light, the bond forged in the cabin hummed between them. He reached up, cupping her cheek. His thumb brushed her lip. "You really hear everything, don't you?" he murmured. "I hear a trap closing," she pleaded. Before Silas could answer, the sound of hoofbeats thundered outside. Not one horse. 20. Silas bolted upright, reaching for his pistol, but the door to the room kicked open. Tobias stood there, a double-barreled shotgun leveled at them. But his face wasn't triumphant. It was tear-stained. "I'm sorry, Silas," Tobias choked out. "They threatened to burn the post. They have my daughter." "Tobias, don't," Silas growled, stepping in front of Ada. "Drop the gun, Mr. Kincaid," a smooth, cultured voice called from the main room. Into the doorway stepped a man who looked entirely out of place in the Wild West. He wore a tailored charcoal suit, a silk vest, and polished city shoes. He was handsome in a sharp, predatory way, with slicked-back pale hair and eyes like chips of flint. Cyrus Vane. "The reunion is over," Vane said, holding a handkerchief to his nose, as if the smell of the trading post offended him. "Take them." The struggle was brief and brutal. Silas roared, launching himself at the first man through the door. He fought like a cornered bear, breaking the nose of a syndicate enforcer and throwing another through a shelf of canned peaches. But he was injured, exhausted, and outnumbered. The butt of a rifle cracked against the back of his head. Ada screamed a raw vocal sound that ripped from her throat as Silas crumpled to the floor. Two men grabbed her, pinning her arms back. She kicked and bit, landing a solid blow to a shin, but they dragged her away from Silas's unconscious body. "Stop!" Vane commanded, raising a hand. The room fell silent, save for the heavy breathing of the men and Ada's frantic gasps. Vane walked over to where Silas lay. He nudged Silas's ribs with the toe of his expensive shoe. Silas groaned, blood matting his hair. "Robust," Vane noted dryly. "I'll give him that." He turned his attention to Ada. He walked closer, inspecting her as one might inspect a prize mare at an auction. He reached out, grabbing her chin and forcing her to look at him. Ada spat in his face. Vane didn't flinch. He slowly wiped the spittle away with his handkerchief, a cruel smile touching his lips. "Feisty," he murmured, "and not the mute little mouse the report suggested. You screamed quite loudly just now." "Go to hell," Ada rasped. "I own hell, my dear," Vane replied smoothly. "And I own this mountain. And now I own you." He turned to his men. "Tie Kincaid to a horse. Drag him. I want him to feel every mile back to the mine." "No." Ada lunged forward, but the guards held her back. "Leave him alone. He needs a doctor." "He needs a grave," Vane corrected. "But I have a special one in mind. The old shaft. Fitting. Don't you think he can join his wife and son?" They dragged Silas out. Ada watched through the window, tears blurring her vision as they tied his hands to a saddle horn. He was limp, barely conscious. Vane turned back to Ada. "Put her in the carriage. She rides with me." The carriage ride was a different kind of torture. It was plush, lined with velvet, and warm. Vane sat opposite her, pouring himself a glass of brandy from a crystal decanter built into the wall. Ada sat frozen, her mind racing. Is Silas dead? Is he dying? She had to stay calm. She had to listen. "You're wondering why I haven't killed him yet," Vane said, taking a sip. Ada didn't answer. She reverted to her old armor. Silence. She stared out the window at the passing trees. "I know you can speak, Miss Miller," Vane said, bored, "though I admit the silence is refreshing compared to most women I know." He leaned forward, his cologne, lavender, and sulfur filling the small space. "Kincaid has something I want. A map. He surveyed these mountains for years before the massacre. He found a vein of silver that runs deeper than anything in the territory. He never filed the claim. He kept it hidden." Ada's eyes flickered to him. Silas had never mentioned silver. "Ah, there it is," Vane chuckled. "Curiosity. He didn't tell you." "Of course not. Silas is a martyr. He thinks the silver is cursed. But I intend to open that vein. And if he won't tell me where it is, maybe he'll tell me to stop you from screaming." Ada felt a cold pit open in her stomach. She was the leverage. "We're going to the Iron Ridge mine," Vane explained. "My headquarters. It's impenetrable. High walls, armed guards, Gatling guns on the towers. No one gets in, and certainly no one gets out." He tapped the glass against his ring. "So get comfortable, Ada. You are about to become the guest of honor at a very painful interrogation." Ada turned her head back to the window. She closed her eyes. She needed to focus. Not on her fear. Not on Vane's voice. She listened to the world outside. She heard the grind of the carriage wheels, the shout of the drivers, and then faintly way back in the distance carried on the wind. Whinny. A horse. A specific horse. Shadow. Silas's horse had a distinctive deep chest rumble when he galloped. She had listened to it for hours. She heard it now. It was far behind them, separated from the group. The men had tied Silas to a horse, yes, but they hadn't realized that Shadow was not a normal beast. Shadow was loyal only to Silas. If Silas was being dragged, Shadow would fight. She strained her ears, pushing past the carriage noise. Snap, thud, scream. A man's scream. Ada's heart leapt. Silas wasn't dead, and he wasn't compliant. She looked at Vane, who was smugly sipping his brandy, believing he had won. A small, dangerous smile touched Ada's lips. "You're smiling," Vane noted, frowning. "Why?" Ada finally looked him in the eye. "Because," she whispered, her voice steady and cold, "you made a mistake. You didn't check the knots." "Excuse me." "You think you caught a wolf," Ada said, "but you just caught the bait." Vane stared at her, confused, just as the carriage jolted violently. But it wasn't an attack. Not yet. They arrived at Iron Ridge. The massive gates creaked open, swallowing them into the belly of the beast. Ada stepped out into a courtyard filled with armed men and machinery. She was in the center of the enemy stronghold, but she wasn't afraid anymore. She had heard the scream on the wind. Silas was loose. He was hurt. He was angry, and he was coming. Vane grabbed her arm. "To the dungeon. Let's see how long Kincaid lasts when we start sending him pieces of you." As they dragged her down into the dark, damp tunnels of the mine, Ada began to memorize the path. She counted the steps. She listened to the echo of the dripping water to judge the size of the rooms. She listened to the tumblers in the locks. Click, click, thunk. She was mapping the prison with her ears, and when Silas came, because she knew he would come, she would be ready to open the door from the inside. Deep within the bowels of the Iron Ridge mine, the air tasted of coal dust and impending death. Cyrus Vane dragged Ada onto the suspended catwalk that spanned the main excavation pit. 50 feet below, black water churned in the sump. "He's dead, my dear," Vane sneered, tightening his grip on her arm. "My men swept the ridge. No one survives that fall." But Vane didn't know Silas Kincaid. A gunshot shattered the rhythmic clanking of the machinery. At the far end of the tunnel, a guard crumpled. Stepping through the smoke was Silas. He was battered, his shirt gone, his chest wrapped in bloody rags, but his blue eyes burned with a terrifying cold fire. He didn't look like a man. He looked like judgment carved from stone. "Kincaid!" Vane screamed, panic cracking his smooth veneer. He pulled a knife, pressing the blade against Ada's throat. "Stay back, I'll cut her." The roar of the steam engines drowned out Vane's voice. Silas, deaf to the threats, and fueled by pure adrenaline, didn't hesitate. He didn't negotiate. He holstered his pistol and charged across the swaying bridge like a bull. "He can't hear you," Ada shouted at Vane, feeling the man's terror spike. Silas collided with them, the impact shaking the entire structure. Vane was thrown backward over the railing, but in his desperation, his hand lashed out, locking around Ada's ankle. Ada slipped off the edge with a scream. Silas lunged, slamming his chest against the metal grate and catching Ada's wrist just before she fell. The scene froze in a terrifying tableau. Silas lay prone on the bridge, his muscles straining to the breaking point as he held Ada's woman's weight. And dangling below her, gripping her boot with a death grip, was Cyrus Vane. "Pull me up," Vane shrieked, swinging wildly over the abyss, "or I take her with me." Silas groaned, his face turning red. He couldn't lift them both. His injured arm was giving out. Ada looked up at Silas. She saw the agony in his eyes. She looked down at Vane, the man who treated people like cattle. She realized she was the link in the chain. "Silas, hold tight," she commanded, her voice ringing clear. She looked down at Vane. "You wanted silence," she hissed. "Enjoy it." Ada swung her free leg, gathering every ounce of rage from the last 5 years, and drove her heel down into Vane's face. Crunch. Vane's nose shattered. His grip failed instantly. He fell silently, plunging into the dark water far below, swallowed by the mine he had built. With a roar of effort, Silas hauled Ada up and over the railing. They collapsed onto the cold metal grate, tangled together, gasping for air. Silas reached out his trembling hand, cupping her face. "You yelled?" he whispered, a broken smile touching his lips. "I heard you, Ada. Through the noise. I heard you. I'm here," she sobbed, burying her face in his neck. "I'm not going anywhere." Spring arrived late in the high country. The cabin stood sturdy against the thawing wind smoke, curling lazily from the chimney. Silas sat on the porch, whittling a piece of cedar. Inside, he could hear Ada singing a soft, tuneless melody as she baked bread. It was the most beautiful sound he had ever known. She stepped out, handing him a cup of coffee and resting her hand on his shoulder. He looked up, covering her hand with his own. They didn't need to speak. The silence between them was no longer a fortress. It was a home. The mountain man had found his voice, and the silent girl had found her song, and in the wild, unforgiving heart of the West, that was all the gold they needed. And that, my friends, is the story of Ada and Silas. From a cruel poker game in a dusty saloon to a fight for survival in the heart of a mountain, they proved that love speaks louder than words. It's a reminder that sometimes the people who seem the most broken are actually the strongest, and that true connection isn't about what you say, but about who is willing to listen. If this story kept you on the edge of your seat, please hit that like button. It really helps the channel grow. Did you expect that twist with the mine rescue? Let me know in the comments below, and if you haven't already, subscribe and ring the bell so you never miss a new story. We have plenty more wild romances and dramatic tales coming your way. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.